All right, so there is a ton of information out there about space weather and human health. Rather than get into necessarily all of the nitty-gritty interpretations about some of these things, let's start with some of the kinds of space weather health alerts that exist. I'm going to be going over some of the actual effects that have been documented that you didn't necessarily hear about. I will stick with the ones that have been corroborated at least twice. But let's start with the type of space weather health alerts that we do have. There are, of course, the solar flare health alerts. That's when we get the X-ray radiation from a sunspot group. We'll be talking about those. We have the energetic particle radiation storms, often called solar radiation storms, and Joan talked a good bit about that. They come from the solar flares and the CMEs. The geomagnetic health alerts as well, and that goes hand in hand with the cosmic rays, and those are both based on the KP index. And so we saw a part of this chart before. We're going to have these here in some of the, in a little bit different order than you saw them in Dr. D'Amico's slide, because there's something I want you to quickly notice and notice right off the bat. In the top two panels, the solar flare and the radiation storm health risk. Those pretty much go as you'd expect. One side of the scale is, low intensity, low scariness, and then the other side of the scale, that's where you get to red and then, taking my cues from the Weather Channel apparently, into magenta. Down at the bottom panel you see the KP index, and this is where things stop going based solely on magnitude, and you start to have a bit more of interest in equilibrium. And so here we see when somebody is studying the KP index or the often used AP index, which Dr. D'Amico described, both the strong geomagnetic storms and the other side of the scale, the cosmic ray events whenever the sun is very, very low, they call these KP0 days, which we'll talk about again. And so while we have solar flares and proton events where if there's nothing going on the sun, you do not have any type of that specific concern from, say, a solar flare or from a particle or from an energetic particle event. But the only way that all good, no worries whatsoever, even for the highest risk patient imaginable, that exists sort of in the middle when it comes to the geomagnetic scale, because on both sides, at KP0 and at KP 8 and 9, we have significant particle introduction that could be affecting the electric environment in which we live. It just so happens that when we have a high KP number, the source of those particles is the sun, and we have a low KP number, the source of those particles are cosmic rays. And so this is the first critical point that it is good to get your head around, that sometimes it is about the magnitude of the event where the concern that should accompany it is directly related to its magnitude, and then sometimes, as with the KP index and as with geomagnetism, you have both sides of the scale, either extreme not being any good. So a good way to think of that is you don't have water for 10 days versus you find yourself at the bottom of 1,000 feet of water. Those are the polar extremes, and neither one would be good for you. And so let's not waste any time. Let's get right into this. Step one, am I at risk? First off, strong events seem to affect everyone. Whether we're talking about ambulance calls, whether we're talking about psychiatry, whether we're talking about cardiac negative outcomes, or just negative health outcomes in general. They've done a number of studies on hospital admissions, and of the ER admissions then to inpatient over months in some cases with thousands of examples. And they find that the strongest events don't seem to be as selective of the high-risk patients. For this, we're talking about X-class solar flares and higher, the highest level solar flares we get. S3, which would be a level 3 radiation storm or higher. Those KP0 days I mentioned, which is when you have a 24-hour stretch of nothing but goose eggs on the KP index, that's considered a KP0 day, a full day of KP0. And then on the other end of that KP scale, KP7 and higher, of course, increasing in severity as you get to 8 to 9, up from 7. Those are considered the strong events, and they do have the potential to affect just about everyone. The effects have been so broad that in some of the literature reviews they have chosen to try to summarize it at the start by saying numerous forcing pathways for human physiological response and behavior in the motor, sensory, autonomic, cognitive, and emotional effect realms. And so again, if there are strong effects, those absolutely can affect everyone. And I'll talk a bit about some of these now. So what are some of the emotional effects that we do see? We see that all the kinds of strong events, whether they are the electromagnetic radiation of a solar flare, the particle storms from the radiation, the particles from cosmic rays, or the magnetic field fluctuations and whatever ULF and VLF come with them, they have been shown to induce anxiety, restlessness, and in other cases, some of the restlessness has been induced by cosmic rays, and some of the excitability or anxiety or feeling like you're on edge and jittery, that can come with the geomagnetic storms. In terms of the cognitive, have you ever been sitting there and you go into autopilot? Whether you're driving or you're reading or you're sitting in class listening to somebody and you just sort of blank out and you realize I have no idea what was just said, or I have no idea what I just read. I've got to go back 2 pages, or how have I gone the last 40 miles without crashing? Some of these dissociative events actually present themselves electromagnetically in our brain waves. And there were 2 studies, one and then a follow-up looking at a few more people, showing that some of these cognitive breaks, our loss in attention, our inability to have the proper memory that we are normally able to display otherwise in normal times, those things can be affected significantly. I will just keep going backwards across that list. Now we're on to autonomic. That would be things like your breathing, your heart rate, various aspects of the sleep cycle and your circadian rhythms and things like that. Sensory is very much closely related to that, and your motor skills. Those are all things that sort of come down from some of the cognitive effects, and even perhaps some of the emotional effects as well. If you are high stress, high anxiety, chances are you're not going to do as good a job with your motor skills. And we'll actually have a pretty good example of what to do coming up in a little later slide. Of course, if you've been watching, you know that you don't have to broaden everything out into motor, sensory, autonomic, things like that. There have been no fewer than 16 articles finding the correlation between negative cardiac events, whether that be stroke, terminal arrhythmia, cardiac arrest, and these space weather events. And we've seen a lot of the psychological effects as well. Most of you could probably find a nurse or somebody who might be able to testify that there are certain times when these things matter. And a lot of times the first thing they'll call out is the full moon. The effect of that extra light on our pineal gland and the melatonin production in our bodies is not insignificant. It's not the kind of thing where you don't sleep for 3 days, all of a sudden you go outside and there's a full moon and you feel great and you can run a marathon. I'm not trying to be that extreme. I'm just saying it's not an insignificant effect that light has. Even just simple, visible light, the white light spectrum. Now, I want to talk about moderate events because they can increase specific risks. Let's say you've survived a heart attack. Or let's say your doctor tells you you're at high risk for something. Or let's say you know that you're bipolar. For high-risk patients, a lot of the disease-specific issues if you are at high risk for a cardiac event, or you've already had one, if you have been informed that you have these psychiatric issues, if you have diabetes, or if you are immunocompromised, maybe the diabetic needed a little bit more insulin today. Maybe their insulin production was affected, or perhaps somebody's arthritis. Somebody's arthritis acts up. All of these sort of autoimmune or immunocompromised issues, anything where your body's attacking itself, especially in the joints. Some of those papers are really fascinating. And also, if you are perfectly healthy, you have never had an issue before in your life, you can still be a high-risk patient. Just get on a high-latitude flight, get on any airline during a KP9 geomagnetic storm, or an S3 or S4 or S5 particle event, we've set up this electrical grid, and we know for a fact that it does a good job taking induction a lot of times, because the transformer blows and the issues from the airlines to the PlayStation network going down are really indicative that our technology and the network that we have set up on the surface is ripe for induction from these events. And because that is the case, it is expected that the ULF and VLF produced by the magnetic fields at the local level are probably about the same or more intense than what you'd get if you were a high-power utility worker and you were going up and you were spending all day in those high utility lines. On a KP9 severe geomagnetic storm day, I think those utility workers would be at severe risk from the induction events and the blowing of the transformers. And as Alfin so wonderfully described, a disruption at any point of the circuit releases all of the energy within the circuit explosively at the point of disruption. And during those days, it turns us all into high-power utility workers in terms of the VLF and ULF to which we are exposed from the magnetic field. So let's say you are able to adequately determine you are at risk. What do you do now? So, step 2, have I already been advised? This is critical, and there'll be 2 slides on this. First, has your doctor said anything to you? Has your doctor told you that you are at high risk? I know that we have a lot of headstrong individuals. I'm one of them. I don't take orders very well. But let me use, for example, the baby aspirin example. So, just as a hypothetical, I am not a physician, and I don't think I need to be to give this piece of medical advice. Let's say you've survived a heart attack, and your doctor says you are really just on the edge here. You need to be on an aspirin regimen or something similar to that, something that a doctor might do, right? And let's say you don't listen because that's who you are. And let's say that also you're thinking about listening at some point, maybe in the future. Maybe you will actually take your doctor's advice at some point. It's not something that you've put out of your head. And you get an alert through the disaster prediction app that says we have a major geomagnetic storm or we have a cosmic ray health emergency. And you are starting to feel that kind of pressure that normally makes you stop and go, oh, but normally you just wait it out or you try to burst through it. Maybe on that day you take the baby aspirin. Now that is an extreme example. I don't think I need to be a doctor to give that piece of medical advice. That's some logical common sense. It's something you might be able to apply to one of your own situations. And so that's a very extreme example, but let's go with the vice example. Let's say you're a smoker. Let's say you're a drinker. Let's say you have other recreational activities that might not be the best for your health. You can make decisions that can affect how your body is reacting at that moment. So, what are the acute effects of smoking a cigarette? Does anyone know?
Higher blood pressure, coffee.
Higher blood pressure, wanting coffee, exactly. We do know that there is the heart rate variability. There is increased heart rate aspects of space weather. And so what if you're already not feeling well and you get that alert and you really want a cigarette and you're like, I don't know if I should do that now or I should wait an hour or I should wait 2 hours or I should maybe just try to throw this pack in the drawer and see if I'll come back to it tomorrow. That's not the easiest thing to do for a smoker, but as you can see, it's the kind of information where you can use what you know and how you've been informed. And speaking about what you know, have you already been advised by yourself? And now, I don't mean you sit and you have conversations with yourself in the mirror, although that's really not a terrible exercise from time to time. But a situational self-awareness. It's good to be aware of the signals that your body is giving you. I would hope if you've survived a heart attack, you know what it might feel like if you're slipping into one of those patterns again. Maybe you recognize that pressure as feeling a little bit different, or your breathing as being a little bit different. Everybody who's even slightly at risk cardiovascularly should know all of the signs of stroke, for example. And so part of this is listening to your body. Is your body advising you? Because that in many ways will be better than what your doctor can tell you. In many ways it will be worse than what your doctor can tell you with his vast amount of knowledge and the information that he can get from your body. But at certain levels and in some ways, what your body is telling you shouldn't be ignored either. And this brings us to the not today example. So, I've got a tightroper that watches me out in California. Also out in California, I know I got a fisherman that watches me. I know that there are people who love engaging in high-risk activities. That tightroper won't do it unless the KP index is 2, 3, or 4. Because he knows that he doesn't have the best focus in school, for example. He knows that he is susceptible to, dozing off and thinking about other things and losing focus at times. And he will not risk dying 900 feet above a chasm during a geomagnetic storm tightrope walk. Now that, again, is an extreme example that you could think of and say, well, okay, yeah, that really makes sense. But how hard would it be for you to apply some of these things to your own life as well? Once you see how a decision process can be made with the baby aspirin example, as preposterous as it was, when you see how that can affect your decision making, what you do with that space weather information at that time. The vice example, recognizing the signs, or the not today example. Maybe you're not going to walk that tightrope today. Step 3, fight back physically. That involves taking control and exercising personal responsibility. This does indeed involve things like keeping yourself healthier. If you know you are at high risk and you don't do anything about it, there can only be so much sympathy if a negative outcome occurs, or so much shock, I should say. If you have the information that lets you take control and be healthier, because a healthier person will be less vulnerable to these things. We do know that if somebody is sick, they are much more likely to be affected by radiation. If somebody's immunocompromised, they're definitely likely to be affected by radiation, things like that. But here is where it really gets cool. Fight back mentally. These things that are potentially coming in from space and having the ability to affect our bodies, they're electromagnetic. You've got an electromagnetic machine up here that is producing brain waves. You have a countervailing force. And it's not as though this countervailing force is totally insignificant. Sure, by any stretch of the imagination, whether you're looking at the size of your brain compared to the sun, or the electrical output, or the magnetic fields, or the range and spectrum of the waves produced, we're not talking about the same kind of stuff. We're talking about a tiny little brain. But at the same time, that tiny little brain is more powerful than the laws of physics and chemistry. That's called the placebo effect. There are these rules called biology and chemistry and physics, and they are supposed to govern what is happening inside your body. You don't have to change those biological, the chemical, and the physical parameters inside your body, although that is one way to change the outcome of things that are going on. Another way is to just think something differently. That's the placebo effect. It is very real, I assure you. Many hundreds of millions of dollars have been dumped into drugs only to be dashed at the last minute by the placebo effect, not being able to outperform somebody thinking that they should get better, not being able to outperform somebody's brain telling their system. It's the placebo effect. It's this mundane thing that you all know about and shrug off, but it means you can overrule the powers of physics and chemistry within the system you control. And that is an absolutely appropriate definition, and don't let anyone tell you you don't have that power. Every time something happens on the sun that could affect human health, I tell myself, all right, you know what's coming. You know what to do with that energy. You even know the spectrum it's coming in on. Don't let it do anything bad. Use it. There's a video I did back in 2011 called I Am HAARP. And if you know what HAARP is, or I suppose if you don't know what HAARP is, it is an ionospheric heater. It basically uses electromagnetism to manipulate plasma way above our heads. And the idea is that you have a HAARP inside of your brain. You have an electromagnetic frequency generator that overpowers physics and chemistry every single day. And there is absolutely no reason why it couldn't help you in these situations as well. And what's important about that is it can hurt you too. I've seen people negative placebo themselves to bits. Somebody gets interested and says, hey, I had this event during this, and it was, it really threw me for a loop because I've never had this negative health outcome before. And was there anything going on the sun on that day? And I come back and I say, well, this was going on and this was going on. And lo and behold, every time something like that happens from then on, they email me and tell me about how bad they feel. It does work both ways. If you think something is going to negatively affect you, it can. If you think positively, I'm not saying you can manifest everything you want in the world, but you can manifest more positivity and happiness in yourself and certainly in others. Moods rub off on people. Some people are magnetic. There's a reason why we describe things in this way, and there's a reason why our brains hold the importance to us that they do. The ability to simply think something and without any other physical action of manifestation, you manifest reality. That is something that nobody should take lightly in terms of the space weather health information. Even if you're the highest risk patient, when you see that alert come through the disaster prediction app, chin up. Tell your body you know what to do with it. Know what's coming, and it's going to hit you good. Like it's a 99 degree and 99 humidity day, and here comes a breeze. Just take it all in. Step 4, never stop learning. These are 3 papers. One of them Dr. D'Amico showed you. These are all, as you can see from the red circles, these are all space weather health articles published just this month, which is half over. These are just February 2018. I would implore you to consider the possibility that a study of even just one person, your N number might not be 1. Let's say you're studying 20 seizure events they have had, or 20 severe migraines they have had, and 20 very, very rare space weather events happened within 5 minutes before they occurred. Something like a KP9, something like an X15 solar flare. Or what if you tracked the interplanetary magnetic field for 10 years And you saw that literally every day for 10 years, there was a correlation between blood pressure or heart rate variability and the KP index or the solar wind. But you only looked at one person. There are different n numbers. You could look at that n as being 1, or you could look at that n number as being 10 times 365. So, or if you're tracking it all day, if you're tracking it by the millisecond, is your n a billion, 10 trillion from one person? It's about the kind of data that you're actually collecting. But in terms of the Never Stop Learning, February, this is not like this is some magic month where everyone's like, hey, we're all going to publish our stuff. This happens every month. Every month, every couple of weeks, there's more and more of these papers coming out. Some of them, I must admit, I do wish would look at more individuals. But when you've got 7 studies that all look at a small number of people, and they all come to the same conclusion with the same type of confidence and the same type of temporal lag and the same type of physical characteristic and physical manifestations of these things happening in their bodies, you kind of begin to get an idea. So this information is still coming out. I'll do my best to catch it all when it comes and make sure I show you in the morning news. Thanks, everyone.